Hello, APUSH students, and welcome to the first of what I'm assuming is going to be many audio reviews of different chapters that we go through. The main goal of this is to get people that might have missed the class ahead and caught up with those that did not, that were in class. But it can also be used as kind of a review. So I plan on going over everything again, maybe in a condensed version, but and in a quicker version, obviously. But nonetheless, same idea of kind of what we have covered so far. So my goal is for to do this for every chapter, and this is going to be for Chapter 4, Imperial Wars. So, Chapter 4, Imperial Wars and Colonial Protest. This takes place essentially right before the American Revolution, or sorry, Revolutionary War. It takes place during the American Revolution, while some of the revolutionary ideas were going on. The first discussion that we talked about was, what leads to war. What is this idea that leads to war? We talked about maybe expansion of power, access to resources, different ideologies, different tensions that are there. Somebody trying to right a wrong, religion. All of these are examples that have in the past led us to war. And here's a map in 1700. You can kind of see we have the 13 colonies here. We have French territory, New France, and this territory. But this is really what we're going to be focused in on, the Ohio River Valley. You can see by this map, potentially this is an 1763 map. Look at the map that we had before. Look at the map that we have here. You can potentially see what has happened, and the fact that the British, or the British really have, the French really have zero colonies yet in the New World. So let's look at the two differences between the colonies. Here's New France versus New England. You can see where New France has been, the Ohio River Valley. They're mainly fur traders with the natives. Very good relationships with the natives. Natives will end up wanting to be on their side numerous times. They still are under control of the French throne, and there are very few permanent settlements, mainly just trading posts and forts for quick trade. And the other thing is the religion is very Catholic. So I don't know if you saw that or not before it got in the way, but the religion is Catholic, and that's going to play a huge role here later on. New England colonies, mainly in the Massachusetts Bay, is what we're looking at. The economy is of commerce and agriculture. Not a great relationship with the natives. Our whole idea is just removal and kind of encroachment. The ruling body is still royal, but it brings up this idea of the fact that the colonists were very self-governed. Salutary neglect is the idea of we're still part of the English throne or English crown, but really they've just kind of left us alone. We're very self-governing. There are a lot of towns and villages, huge communities, unlike the French, who have very few of these. And the other thing is they're Puritan or Congregationalist. They're Protestant, so the not opposite of Catholic, but for our purposes, the opposite of Catholic. Here's a couple of the wars that had gone on prior to the 7 Years' War, prior to the war that we're dealing with. The whole idea behind this is that the British have been or are at war all the time. The British and the French specifically, are kind of competing for a lot of the same stuff. British and the Spanish are competing for a lot of the same things, whether it's resources, land, whatever it may be. So you can kind of see some of the wars that have been going on prior to this. But our conversation right now is going to be over the 7 Years' War, and the I guess you could say the American theater of that is going to be the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is really all about the Ohio River Valley. The idea of stopping westward growth from the settlers and not encroaching onto France. When fighting does begin in the colonies, the American troops are not considered a strong force yet. Um, they're considered very amateur, and so British provided troops. And two things happened. One, the colonists didn't like that. They thought that that was kind of a slap in the face, and so their pride was injured a little bit. But it also is going to have a lasting effect on the French. So war begins 1754, and you have George Washington who takes over. He's sent out to Fort Duquesne and to try to aid westward expansion there, I guess. And so they build this Fort Necessity, or they're going to build this Fort Necessity. It's not really a fort; it's basically a bunch of sticks that are thrown together. But this is where we get to at least meet George Washington. And July 3rd, 1754, he actually surrenders. Um, that won't be the last time, but it will end up being a lot more effective, or the colonists will be a lot more effective after that. This flag is something that we've looked at a few times. It's the Albany Plan of Union flag, and you can see the idea of a snake, and it's a splintered snake, or it's a severed snake, signifying the different colonies, and that if we don't join together, if we don't combine together, then obviously the snake will die. And it was actually created by Benjamin Franklin, developed by Benjamin Franklin. The whole design, or the whole idea, was that it was going to protect the colonies from the French. It's kind of our first intercolonial government. The Albany Plan of Union was a system of recruiting troops, collecting taxes, colonial defense. It really is going to set the precedent for the Continental Congress in 20 years. So, 1755 was essentially the French were winning. There was scalpings because they had the natives on their side, and so the British decided that they were going to do the same thing. And the government actually offered $50 for a woman's scalp and $130 for a warrior's scalp, and just to get people interested in fighting and get people interested in there. It all ends in 1763 with the British winning. Again, the whole idea of it doesn't really matter. It's a 7 years war that, as you can tell, lasts 9 years, at least if you include the English side of it, or the American side of it. But the treaty that ends the French and Indian War is the Treaty of Paris. And essentially, Britain takes all of the settlements from the French, including Canada, including the Ohio River Valley, basically any lands east of the Mississippi. Spain, who was an ally of ours, cedes Florida, and they were given Cuba. Spain gains all land west of Mississippi. The French do retain some forts, mainly for some trading purposes, kind of more down in the Bahamas, as well as St. Lawrence River. What this does is it's changing the British to the greatest naval power in the world, and it just creates this huge empire. But the whole idea, or the whole important parts of this, is that Britain gained Canada and all lands east of Mississippi, and France is now out of North America for the most part. So the results, Native Americans really did not love the British. The whole idea of encroachment on the Native Americans really puts a sour taste in their mouth, which it should. And so we have a couple problems. One, we have the Pontiac Rebellion in 1763. Chief Pontiac was a Native American chief that led an attack against colonial settlements in the West. The British sent troops to put down the rebellion. They didn't trust the colonists again to do anything about it, and so that's one strike that the colonists see against them. They really just didn't want any more problems, and so they signed the Proclamation of 1763. And this is a big issue. The colonists just won a war against the French for this land, and now the British government is telling them that they can't have this land because the Proclamation of '63 essentially prevented any expanse of to the west in the Ohio River Valley, which is the same thing that they won. The British didn't want any more conflicts with the natives, and so they passed the Proclamation of 1763. As you can see by these memes, they really did not follow it at all. So here's what the Proclamation of '63 line said: that there is no, this is reserved for Indians, and there is no settlement out west of this line. To pay for the 7 Years' War and all the other wars that they had been doing, Britain essentially had been spending like it's going out of style. And so they were absolutely broke. And as with most people, when you're broke, you tax. You try to gain money somehow. And so they taxed. And there's sugar and molasses tax. There was a currency tax. There was a currency act, I should say. There was the Stamp Act, and the Stamp Act is basically a tax on all legal documents, newspaper pamphlets, advertisements, anything of the sort. Here are the other taxes that we were just talking about. It's the difference between the Stamp Act and everything else is the Stamp Act was the first direct tax on the colonists. Everything else was a tax on merchants, whereas the Stamp Act was, or stamp tax was actually a direct tax on merchants. And so they're not going to be happy about it. We're going to introduce to the Sons of Liberty. We're going to see a lot of boycotting, a lot more smuggling of goods, and all of it is in response to King George III, who was known as a Mad King. Chances are he was actually suffering from some kind of mental illness, whether it was bipolar or what it might have been. But yeah, King George probably did suffer from mental illness. So in 1765, a group of people met as kind of a colonial assembly, and that what they decided from this is that the Stamp Act or the stamp tax is essentially unconstitutional, and that only colonial assemblies have the right to tax colonies, and that the colonies and colonists in them possessed all the rights of Englishmen. And since they do not have voting rights, Parliament can't virtually represent colonists, because that's what they're saying is that, well, we are virtually representing you, and that's just not what the Stamp Act Congress thought. So Sons of Liberty, Daughters of Liberty, these are groups that are kind of protest groups. They are formed as an anti-English, anti-tax group, very rebellious, maybe go a little too far, I guess. Many people don't know much about the Daughters of Liberty, but they were just as important and just as equals as the Sons of Liberty. One of the things that they used to use is tar and feathering, where if you had loyalists, if you had Tories, if you had tax collectors, if you had somebody who was very pro-British, what they would do is they would tear off their clothes, pour boiling hot tar on them, and then throw feathers all over them and parade them through the city. Here's a video of it. I'm not going to watch, but you certainly can. The other thing that they use is burning effigies. Basically, they burn something that looked like a Tory or looked like a tax collector. It would have Tory or tax collector written on it, and it would they would burn it just as a protest or as kind of a warning, really, to them. So Congress listens, or I should say that the Parliament listens, and in 1766 they actually repeal the Stamp Act, but they do pass the Declaratory Act, and the Declaratory Act basically said that the Parliament hath and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. So they basically say that we're going to repeal the Stamp Act, but we are asserting our belief that we can tax you, and that we can virtually represent you. So in all cases whatsoever, they're allowed to tax. Then we get to Townshend Acts, and the Townshend Acts or Townshend Acts are kind of the one of the final straws that really push people over the edge. Townshend Acts are taxes on imports, so tea, glass, paper, paint. Um, and the difference between this is, most of us pay taxes, and when we pay taxes, we expect it to go something useful: roads, schools, buildings, infrastructure, whatever. These taxes were basically to make money to pay for the officials that are in the colonies. They're not doing anything to advance the colonies at all. It's just paying them to do it. It also, a couple of things that Townshend Acts did. It allowed the government, the governor, or soldiers to search private homes without warrant from a judge. Quartering Act, it allowed them to house troops. This kind of gets us the idea of taxation without representation. And that's kind of when it first comes out, as the idea of being taxed without represented, instead of being, they don't believe that they should be virtually represented. They need to actually have representation. And that's, at this point in time, what they want. John Dixon, in a letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania, essentially he writes this to get people on the side of the revolution and of rebellion. And so we actually pass that out. There should be a copy of that in classroom, and more pamphlets. The Circular Letter by Sam Adams and James Otis. This is kind of where Sam Adams becomes radical, I guess you could call him. He was a tax collector at one point in time, and then he just never forced anybody to pay taxes. And so, as a result of a lot of these, Lord North actually repealed the Townshend Acts. Then on March 5th, 1770, we have the Boston Massacre. Boston Massacre is one of those events that is, I guess it kind of begins the revolution. I don't know. I think that it there's been talkings, there's been rumblings, and then this happens, and it just gets people. When violence like this happens, it gets people on board. And so a crowd of colonists essentially got into a scuffle with a group of British soldiers, and those soldiers fired into the crowd, killing five colonists. They were getting snowballs thrown at them with ice and rocks, and they were getting assaulted, and they were getting kind of beat up by the colonists. I equated a lot to what was happening in the summer, where you had people protesting, you had people get upset, and the British officers ended up firing. They're all put on trial for murder, and they were acquitted. John Adams was their representation, and he got them all acquitted. So the Committee of Correspondence is initiated by Sam Adams. The whole goal of the Committee of Correspondences was to essentially warn neighboring colonies about incidents with Great Britain. It's a way to keep people in the loop, and people, obviously it's very biased. It's going to, anything that they feel is wrong is going to be, expanded 10 times more, because people are looking for it. And so what the idea of the Committee of Correspondence is that it broadens the resistance movement. It broadens people that are, want to be on the side of revolution. It's getting people on the side of revolution. Another incident that most people don't know about is the Gaspee incident, where just off the Rhode Island coast, a bunch of Sons of Liberty members boarded this ship, looted it, and then torched it. It was a customs schooner, so it was basically looking for people that were smuggling, looking for people that were doing illegal activities. So it's not like it was doing anything. It wasn't anything bad, really. But Rhode Island was kind of a hotbed for smuggling, and so it was off the coast of Rhode Island, and they just had to burn it, dressed as Indians again, or not again, for the first time. In 1773, they passed the Tea Act as, the the crown is upset. The crown is upset at what's going on. Colonists refuse to buy British tea. They're buying Dutch tea. They're buying smuggled Dutch tea. And so the colonists refused to buy British tea, almost as just a sign of solidarity. So the Tea Act actually lowered the tax on tea, but it also said smuggling is illegal and everything else is illegal. It actually is lower than the price of smuggled goods. So the tea that they would get legally is cheaper than the tea that they would get illegally, and better, mind you. And basically, this was an idea behind the British government of trying to protect the East India Company. It was a bailout for the most part. They were in basically failing, and the government's trying to help them out. And so they passed a tea tax, which said that it was illegal to buy any tea besides theirs. It was legal to smuggle goods. They're going to enforce it more. And the British colonists just said, no, we're not. Even though it's cheaper, we're not going to do it. We did not want to legitimize the tax. They didn't want to, is almost that they didn't want to accept that they were getting taxed. And so 1773, as a result, or in response to the tea tax, a bunch of Sons of Liberty members dressed as Indians boarded a ship that carried 342 chests of tea, and they dumped that 342 chests of tea in the harbor, equivalent to about 18.5 million tea bags worth. In today's value, over $1 million worth of tea was dumped into the Boston Harbor. British government is, again, not happy at all. Not happy at all with what is going on. So they passed this Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts of 1774. Basically what they did is, first of all, they closed the port of Boston. They said no more, nothing going in, nothing going out. They put their naval ships and blockaded the port of Boston. Nothing goes in, nothing goes out. Second one is a government act, and this said that it just helped them regulate what was going on in Massachusetts Bay. It said that there was going to be an impartial administration of justice, and if need be, they'll go back to Britain for it. What else was passed was a new quartering act, basically putting more restrictions on colonists, forcing them to quarter troops that are in there for their safety, their benefit. They don't have a choice. They have to do it. They have to feed them. They have to give them shelter. They have to give them protection, all that. And we were talking about the Administration of Justice Act. The other thing that was passed is the Quebec Act, and Quebec said that not only can you not go past this, but instead we're going to actually give it to Quebec. So not the colonists that are here, but the people that are in Canada and Quebec. This is now your territory. So it ticked off the colonists that were already there, because they said, we already are going into this area. Now you're giving it to the Quebecians. And they also made Catholic the official religion of this territory. And obviously these are Protestant. And so they're upset about that. So that is that is the end of our conversation. And that is the notes for today. And that is the review of Chapter 4.